There was not a moment to lose. He pulled the axe out, swung it up with both hands, hardly conscious of what he was doing, and almost mechanically, without putting any force behind it, let the butt end fall on her head. His strength seemed to have deserted him, but as soon as the axe descended, it all returned to him. The old woman was, as usual, bareheaded. Her thin fair hair, just turning grey and thick with grease, was plaited into a rat's tail and fastened into a knot above her nape with a fragment of horn comb. Because she was so short, the axe struck her full on the crown of the head. She cried out, but very feebly, and sank in a heap to the floor. Still with enough strength left to raise both hands to her head, one of them still held the pledge. Then he struck her again, and yet again, with all his strength, always with the blunt side of the axe, and always on the crown of the head. Blood poured out as if from an overturned glass, and the body toppled over on his back. He stepped away as it fell, and stooped to see the face. She was dead. Her wide open eyes looked ready to start out of their sockets. Her forehead was wrinkled, and her whole face convulsively distorted. This was the first act of a man splitting his soul, coming apart, not in a way that would be rectified unless if he had to go through such deep, honest suffering. This was the first act of him totally, violently wrenching himself away from humanity as a whole. This is quite an episode. Most people nowadays, they do believe that you can make your own moral standards, you can make your own moral worldview. That in and out of itself is just the terrible idea. Murders will happen. People will justify them based on their own moral proclivities and beliefs. It is really bad. It is really bad. And then he goes on to split his own soul even further. Let me read you this one. There in the middle of the floor, with a big bundle in her arms, stood Lizaveta, as white as sheet, gazing in frozen horror at her murdered sister, and apparently without the strength to cry out. When she saw him run in, she trembled like a leaf, and her face twitched spasmodically. She raised her hand as if to cover her mouth, but no scream came, and she backed slowly away from him towards the corner, with her eyes on him in a fixed stare, but still without a sound, as though she had no breath left to cry out. He flung himself forward with the axe. Her lips writhed pitifully like those of a young child when it's just beginning to be frightened and stands ready to scream with its eyes fixed on the object of its fear. The wretched Lizaveta was so simple, browbeaten and utterly terrified that she did not even put up her arms to protect her face, natural and almost inevitable as the gesture would have been at this moment when the axe was brandished immediately above it. She only raised her free left hand a little and slowly stretched it out towards him as though she were trying to push him away. The blow fell on her skull, splitting it open from the top of the forehead almost to the crown of the head and felling her instantly. Raskolnikov, completely beside himself, snatched up her bundle, threw it down again, and ran to the entrance. There it is again, a second split of his own soul. Terrible ideas. The conclusion of any argument that does not take objective morality into account always ends up in murder of innocents, no matter how benign. I know this is a bold claim, but history will bear me out on this one. Because in the very center of objective morality, or the objective moral outlook, the intrinsic value of personhood of individuals is taken for granted and believed. And really, there isn't any rational argument that can be employed to prove that everyone has some God-given value. It takes something more than logic to believe this. Dare I say, faith. But I'm Catholic, so it is easy for me to say. You might think from the title of the video and from the reading that I've just done that the murders of Elena and Lizaveta are the scariest part of the novel, but you'd be mistaken. The scariest part of the story is about something that is much more sinister, something much more unprovoked, something that can remain unseen but infects the minds of people. The scariest bit of the novel is about a corrupt idea that infected the student Raskolnikov's mind. Now, here's a young man, Raskolnikov, who is studying to become a lawyer in Petersburg. In his mind, he had the idea of becoming a great man. And you might ask, what is a great man? And how do you even begin to define a great man? Well, I don't know the answer to that one. I know that a great man is someone that holds to his principles, has order, has structure, and not only that, but he protects those he loves and those he himself does not necessarily know by telling them the truth. A great man, according to him though, according to Raskolnikov, is someone who can step outside the world, culture, and traditions. He is someone that can justify his existence without having to refer to morals of the day, or in this case, the objective morals of the world and of those that he deemed to be lesser men. He even says so himself to the detective Porphyry, and I quote, Porphyry says, "The point is that in this article, people are divided into two classes, the ordinary and the extraordinary. The ordinary ones must live in submission and have no right to transgress the laws, because you see, they are ordinary, and the extraordinary have the right to commit any crime and break every kind of law just because they are extraordinary." I think that is what you say, if I'm not mistaken. This was Porphyry asking Raskolnikov. And Raskolnikov comes back around and he says, "That is not quite what I say," he began simply and modestly. "I admit, however, that you have given an almost correct exposition of it, or even, if you like, a completely faithful one." He found it almost pleasurable to agree that the account was faithful. The only difference is that I do not in the least insist that the extraordinary people are absolutely bound and obliged to commit offenses on any and every occasion as you say I do. I hardly think any such article would have been allowed to be published. I simply intimate that the extraordinary man has the right. I don't mean a formal official right, but he has the right in himself to permit his conscience to overstep the danger of such an idea. So anyone who could possibly claim to be a great man can overstep. But then what's the furthest step that anyone can take if he or she were to overstep? Let's continue. This is the scariest chapter. When I read it, I shuddered. I felt my soul trying to wrestle with Raskolnikov from inside the pages of this book, trying to just wrench him away from this stupid idea. You were pleased to say that my article is not clear. I am ready to elucidate for you as far as possible. Perhaps I am not mistaken in supposing that is what you want. Well then, in my opinion, if the discoveries of Kepler and Newton, by some combination of circumstances, could not have become known to the world in any other way than by sacrificing the lives of 1 or 10 or 100 more people who might have hampered or in some way been obstacles in the path of those discoveries, then Newton would have had the right, or might even have been under obligation, to remove those 10 or 100 people so that his discoveries might be revealed to all mankind. It does not follow from this, of course, that Newton had the right to kill any Tom, Dick, or Harry he fancied, or go out stealing from market stalls every day. I remember further that in my article, I developed the idea that all the, for example, the lawgivers and regulators of human society, beginning with the most ancient and going on to Lycurgus, Solon, Muhammad, Napoleon, and so on, were without exception transgressors by the very fact that in making a new law, they ipso facto broke an old one, handed down from their fathers and held sacred by society. And of course, they did not stop short of shedding blood, provided only that the blood, however innocent and however heroically shed in defense of the ancient law, were shared to their advantage. It is remarkable that the greater part of these benefactors and lawgivers of humanity were particularly bloodthirsty. Wow. He says all of this, believing that there are extraordinary people and ordinary people that somehow must just accept being trampled on by these extraordinary people. And he claims that if somebody else was to stop an extraordinary person from bringing into the world something that is much more beneficial, they do have the right and obligation to go ahead and remove the ordinary people. This is something that is just baffling. Razumikin, who had been a boon companion to the corrupt Raskolnikov, was scared and kept repeating, "It cannot be." Because for him, logic, although useful, is not the answer to all of living, he says. He says that living is a process of life. Perhaps one day I'll make a video on the wisdom of Razumikin. But here is his friend who is willing to employ only logic to make a moral world. Raskolnikov is terribly lost in this case. And then he continues, speaking of ordinary people providing material. The first group, that is the material. Those would be the ordinary people such as myself and you, sir. There are endless subdivisions, of course, but the distinctive characteristics of the two categories are fairly well marked. The first group, that is the material, are generally speaking by nature staid and conservative. They live in obedience and like it. In my opinion, they ought to obey because that is their destiny, and there is nothing at all degrading to them in it. The second group are all the lawbreakers and the transgressors, or are inclined that way, in the measure of their capacities. The aims of these people are, of course, relative and very diverse. For the most part, they require, in widely different contexts, the destruction of what exists in the name of better things. Where do we often hear this argument? We hear it on television, we hear it from socialists, we hear it from communists, we hear it from woke culture, people that believe that somehow there's a better world and human nature can be perfected and that people can be changed and there's nothing that limits us and our knowledge and our ability so long as we apply scientific methods. That is madness. It draws us very closer to madness. And then Porphyry continues. He asks him a very simple question, which I do believe is very important. And he says, "Thank you. But tell me, how do you distinguish these extraordinary people from the ordinary? Do signs and portents appear when they are born?" I mean, to say that we could do with rather greater accuracy here, with, so to speak, rather more outward signs. Please excuse the natural anxiety of a practical and well-meaning man, but couldn't there be, for example, some special clothing? Couldn't they carry some kind of brand or something? Because you will agree, if there should be some sort of mix-up and somebody from one category imagined that he belonged to the other and began to remove all obstacles. As you so happily put it, this observation of yours is even more penetrating than the last. But you must realize that the mistake is possible only among the first group, that is, the ordinary people, as I have called them, perhaps not altogether happily. In spite of their inborn inclination to obey, quite a number of them, by some freak of nature, such as is not impossible even among cows, like to fancy that they are progressives, destroyers and propagators of the new word, and all this quite sincerely. This man has truly destroyed himself with this idea. He's terribly corrupt. Raskolnikov struggled to connect with other students, I think because he believed himself to be truly marked out to be a great man. Everyone, according to him, is a hindrance unless he chooses them himself to be extraordinary people. And how that is done is a question that he couldn't even properly answer when Porphyry asked him. For him, morality is governed by the politics of power. It is something that can be subjectively engineered to fit the preferences of the extraordinary people. And good luck to those who do not fit the preferences of the superior people. But the political power is broken and has always been broken. And so even the most powerful people, after being laden with so much prestige and influence and responsibility, snap. He himself had committed an outrageous crime. He murdered innocent people. What? To prove his own merits. The objective morality that all of us live in, all of us ordinary people. It rejected his argument. It rejected his conclusions. And he had split himself in two. The one side wanted so much to return to the center of simple truth and not to have to lie, to return to an objectively moral world where there's right and wrong written in the fabric of existence, of everyday being. And the other side, now his own reality, subjective moral world where having killed, he still believed himself to be right. Isn't that close to madness? And in this second world, unfortunately, he has essentially been locked out from interacting with ordinary people freely. He banned himself from speaking the truth. His conscience wouldn't allow him to rest one moment though. Every finger was an accusing finger. Every private conversation was gossip about him and all the crimes that he's committed. Every lawman was after him. But the only way to bring himself together is to tell the truth, is to confess his crimes. Who better to help him along this journey where he now has to come back to the center, where he now has to re-enter the objective moral world than someone who himself will consider an ordinary person. Not strong, not bright, someone he considers stupid, but innocent. Innocent Sonia. And he does this by asking Sonia very, very simple question. He goes on to say, I said it not because of your dishonor and your sin, but because of your great suffering. That you are a great sinner is true, he added, and almost exultantly. But your greatest sin is that you have abandoned and destroyed yourself in vain. Is that not horrible? Is it not horrible that you live in this filth, which is so loathsome to you, while at the same time you know you have only to open your eyes that you are helping nobody by it and not saving anybody from anything? Tell me, he said, almost frenziedly, how such shame and such baseness can exist in you side by side with your feelings so different and so holy. Surely it would be better, 1,000 times better and wiser to plunge into the water and end it all. It is not to be, because he wondered, how is it possible that someone like Sonia could possibly have the ability to be objectively moral but be a great sinner at the same time? It would appear that she, in fact, is the extraordinary person that he was overlooking, because poor Sonia is poor, she's weak, she's not as strong as Napoleon and all of those men that he's just mentioned. He sits there and he wonders, could a healthy mind make her judgments? How can she possibly crouch over her own destruction above the stinking pit into which she is being drawn and wave her hands and stop her ears when she is told of the danger? She's blind to all of these things, and there's a reason why. He asks Sonia, so you pray a great deal to God, Sonia? And Sonia said nothing. He stood and waited for her to answer, and Sonia said, what should I do without God? He said in rapid, forceful whisper, glancing at him for a moment out of suddenly flashing eyes and pressing his hand with hers. Well, there it is, he thought. And what does God do for you in return? He asked. Sonia was silent for a long time, as though unable to answer. Her flat little chest heaved with agitation. Be quiet. Do not ask. You are not worthy. Now Lazarus is approaching. Here's a man who began with a ridiculous idea, ready to be saved, ready to be brought back home. And how does that happen? It happens because the previous couple of days, Lizaveta had visited Sonia and they had read the Bible together, and they read the raising of Lazarus. Raskolnikov says to Sonia, read, I want you to. He insisted. He used to read to Lizaveta. Now, Sonia begins to save a man from himself. Now, a certain man was sick named Lazarus of Bethany. She pronounced at last with an effort, but after 2 or 3 words, her voice broke like an overstrained violin string. And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary sat still in the house. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. She stopped again, Sonia, and anticipating with shame that her voice would again begin to quiver and break. Jesus saith unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha saith unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall live. The raising of a man. Raskolnikov. I think when he was speaking with Sonia, when he asked Sonia why she was doing what she was doing and whether she was destroying herself in vain, he was partly talking to himself. He was trying to convince himself of the simple truth of what he had done. Severed himself from the objective moral world. He had sacrificed himself in vain because his idea was without God.